So this afternoon, I'm working on an 11 by 14 inch panel. It's actually a canvas panel, so it's a little bit more of an absorbent panel than I'm used to working on. And instead of doing like a tone or a wash covering the whole surface, I'm just going to do kind of like a runny block in with some of the main colors that I'll be putting into the scene. So this alizarin crimson is what I usually do my sketch in, and I'm just really thinning it down quite a bit and very loosely and with a lot of like gesture and energy, laying it in sort of like a wash, but painting the shapes. And all of this that I'm blocking in is kind of like the shadow areas. So what I'm painting is Cathedral rock, and essentially that whole piece of the rock to the right is more so in shadow. And then I do have some shadows on that more rounded rock to the left. And that feature in the middle, which some people refer to as the prayer hands or as a man and a woman standing back to back, that's in shadow as well. So this is probably going to be one of my darker areas of the painting. More of a mid to dark. Some of the darks in the foreground trees will be a little bit darker. And now I'm blocking in the sky. So I've still got a pretty thin down mixture. I think just like an ultramarine blue and some titanium white. And this is kind of helping me to carve the contours of that shape of the rock that I just kind of sketched in a little bit roughly. So the sky is helping me to kind of carve that a little more intentionally. And then I've used my fun new like rubber scraper tool for the clouds. And I've just wiped away little pieces of the sky that I blocked in. So really it's like the white of the panel that you're seeing as the clouds, and then shaping them with the sky color wash that I'm using. And I think as I go throughout the painting, I think what I end up doing is leaving those clouds there, which is kind of interesting. So if you're working, if you don't have a toned ground, you can use the white showing through for things like clouds or snow or highlights of water, that kind of thing. So not always working with that orange wash opens up some of those other possibilities, almost like a watercolor or something. And I suppose with watercolor, you would just, leave it versus taking away. And I've got a lot of foliage at the base of this giant rock feature. And there's some really beautiful fall leaves, I would say a little more on the left-hand side. There's some really bright yellows and some more kind of like reddish browns. And then the tops of some of those cottonwoods are really intensely green, especially when the sun is hitting them. So not quite like, really like fiery reds or yellows, but a little more kind of beginning fall colors, I would say. And I love painting here in the fall. Crescent Moon Ranch is along Oak Creek, and there's so many deciduous trees that grow along the riparian course. So you get these really beautiful fall colors against the red rocks. And I've actually used my wipe scraper tool to remove where I want some of those highlights to be on the trees. And then I also dragged it through the bottom part of the painting for the ground plane. And so what that did is it kind of just like dragged some of those greens over the white of the canvas, creating like a really beautiful lighter value field here in the foreground. And so how I'm working is super intuitively. I'm really feeling out the composition. I kind of started with an idea of how I wanted to design this piece, but I'm allowing that idea to be fluid and work with the paint as I'm going, and working with what I'm seeing, and just kind of responding to the shapes that I'm putting down and how it relates to all the shapes as a whole. And I think I'm more comfortable doing that now that I have a way to kind of like wipe away. So I think I've shown in previous videos how this tool has definitely affected my process in some paintings more than others, but if anything, it's just allowing me to really explore the more intuitive sides of my process, I think, and that's really fun and really valuable. Something I enjoy a lot about this scene is how those bright greens on the top of the tree are kind of standing out from that piece of the rock that's more in shadow. And then I've really put some nice blue notes over that alizarin for the vegetation that's in shadow in the distance. And I'm definitely like using more blue and lavender for that vegetation because it's overlapping right with those strong greens in the foreground. And I really want to make sure that those read as separate. So, that color mixture really isn't a green at all, but kind of appears as like a distant green because of what's around it. And kind of dragging it up into some of those cracks of the rock and, giving the suggestion of where like a new formation begins and where the planes are shifting. And now I can kind of move into these unpainted spots in the cliffs that are really the parts of the rock that are in light. Funny enough, there's some clouds behind me and the sun is moving in and out of them. So the rocks are really not lit up in the same way right now, but because, I've got all of my shadows blocked in, I can kind of read the light because of that. And then when the sun comes back out, I can gather what information I can't get from these value notes that I made in the beginning. So now it's back out a little, and that's helping me to kind of refine some of these light and shadow areas. And with my red rock mixture, I've kind of got the alizarin crimson and my cad lemon yellow. So that's a pretty cool mixture. But these rocks are definitely kind of more distant. So they have like more of a pinkish feel than like an orange feel. And so, if they were more orange, I would probably use a warmer yellow or like a warmer red. In some passages, I think I'll add a little bit of the cadmium red into some of the mixtures just to warm it up a little more, but really the alizarin crimson and cad lemon work pretty well. Just the smallest touch of blue to, make it a little bit less chromatic and help it to harmonize a bit more. There's definitely some pieces of the rock and shadow that like feel a little bit more orange. So, adding some of that back in. And then these upper layers of sandstone get a little more like yellow orange and like lighter too. So adding some yellow and white into that mixture as they move up the rock face. And there's a lot of, different cracks and shapes within these shapes, but I'm just aiming to keep it more simplified, especially because I'm not just focusing on Cathedral rock. I've also got a lot of stuff going on in the foreground. So I'm just kind of refining these rocks a little bit by adding darker values and like the shadow areas in the rock and kind of where the different shapes or planes meet. And usually when I have like a darker value indicating that the form is in shadow, I'll have like a transitional middle value next to that in the light, depending on, the form. If it's more rounded, if it's more square, it'll be a harder edge and more of the dark on one plane and the light on the other. And I've got all these like interesting boulders leading up to the more upright parts of the rock. And just be careful not to like make repetitive shapes there. I've kind of squeezed it into the composition a little bit more. So you kind of have it like peeking through the trees. Not quite as much of it is visible. And then my green vegetation on the rock in the distance that's in light and not in shadow is definitely more of like a very grayed, desaturated green. And so that's just got a little bit more blue in there with white to push it back into the distance. And now that I've kind of got most of that red rock feature blocked in, or I would say it's pretty much painted for the most part, now I can go back in to those foreground trees and finish modeling those. And with my greens, I'm trying to have a little bit of variation in there. So ones that are a bit like closer on the left side have a bit more kind of like a red, yellow, and then the trees that I'm working on right now are with a bit more blue. So I'm still kind of working with a really limited palette, just the primary colors and white. And so when I'm making greens, I'm mixing blue and yellow. If it's lighter, I've got more yellow. If it's darker, I've got more blue. And then I'm constantly asking myself, like, what temperature is that green? Is it warmer? If it's warmer, I'll add more red or yellow. And then if it's cooler, I'll add more blue, and sometimes white. So that's really how I mix my greens typically. And paying attention to where the contours of the shapes kind of overlap and where you have these moments of passages of light. And then I've actually used my little wiper tool to take away paint where I want this little cabin. And then, so really I just made some kind of rectangular shapes with that tool. And then I'm using the brush to, with the green on the brush to kind of edit those lines. And using a very like generalized perspective. So I've got a little bit of a horizon line there, and then angling it up for the roof, and then down for the bottom of the cabin structure. And that's a really beautiful brown. The roof of the cabin it looks kind of like it's a metal, and it's reflecting the color of the sky a good amount. So I've dropped in some of that sky color to the roof. And then using a darker brown, almost towards a reddish black, for where the roof is overhanging and casting a shadow. But beyond that, you really don't need a lot more to describe the structure that's there. I'm not going to get into like any of the paneling on the wood or any of the ridges on the roof, or even that little window that's there. I really like how almost like undefined it is. But I think it reads really well on the landscape, and it helps that that foreground plane to kind of sit more flat and to just feel more spacious. And I like how it's kind of amongst the trees here. As soon as you add something like a cabin, or a person, or, you know, something in the sky like a planet or a balloon, you're really adding an additional narrative element. So I think for a lot of people, when we see a structure, we can almost place ourselves in the scene in a different way. Not saying that you can't create a really strong narrative in the landscape alone, which is what I often do. But as soon as you add something like that, it adds, a different aspect to the scene. So now with that little cabin on the ranch placed, I can create some overlaps with the trees in front of it and just help it to sit back in the landscape even more. So I've got a lot of yellow leaves right here on this tree that's kind of in front of the structure. And there's a little bit of like kind of orangey red behind it. And that really is a beautiful passage of color there, kind of draws your attention to that part of the painting even more. And I've got some more middle tone greens. On some of these trees and bushes at the foreground, right in front of those big cottonwoods that have a lot of those like brighter, more saturated greens. And just adding a little bit more of the orange to the foliage on the other side, varying the height and the shape a little, but I think that balances out the color on the opposite end and kind of funnels your vision into that more central focus of the painting, which in my mind is kind of the cabin, and then above it, that kind of spire feature in the middle of the rocks. And you'll notice that I've added some like dark accents and branches and trunks in there too, just so that it reads a little better. And I'm constantly going back and forth with that contour line to make it feel, naturalistic, but it's also kind of in a man-made scene where it's maintained, so you don't have a lot of like tall grasses and organic shapes. It's a pretty flat shape there, and there's the red sand and then green vegetation, new growth. So I've added a little kind of like yellowish white into that red rock color to, make it come forward a little more than the red rocks in the distance. And then that green is more saturated, and it's also got more blue because it's reflecting more of the sky. It's a flat plane. And what I love about that is how complementary they are. So there's just so much about this painting where it's the relationships between the greens and the red varieties. And honestly, that's a big part of painting Sedona, is playing with that complementary color combination. At least for me, that has a lot to do with it. And I'm trying to communicate this foliage a bit more without breaking it up too much. I want to keep, these masses unified and keep these strong shapes. So, I don't want to get too much into painting the leaves or what have you. I want to keep it simplified because you really do have a lot going on in the scene. So I'll continue to refine the shapes a bit more and, pull them together. And something that I always do when I'm painting is that I work around the entire painting. I don't just stay in one area and finish it. I jump around a lot. So I'm actually going back into this rock in the middle and refining that. And even though that whole piece is in kind of more of a shadow, there is some lighter pieces to it. And then I'll continue to use the color of the sky to carve out the shapes of the rocks and the contours a bit more. And usually I get that kind of more established earlier on in the painting. But, I really feel like I just kind of finished painting everything in, and part of carving out these shapes has a lot to do with refining as a whole. A lot of times I'll use cerulean blue hue as my main sky color, and then, the cad lemon towards the horizon with white. But because I've got a lot of cooler reds and blues in the scene, I think that, using the ultramarine on its own next to those other color combinations is going to just feel warmer. So ultramarine blue is classified as kind of like a warm blue. And then just by adding some white to that as the sky moves closer to the horizon. And like I said, I'm leaving the white of the canvas for the clouds. So I had, wiped those shapes out in the beginning when I put down that sky color wash. And yeah, I think it's still working in the painting. So, when I'm moving around the painting, I'm constantly checking the decisions that I made previously and, saying, is this still working? Because everything that you do in a painting is relative to a decision that you made. So, a color on its own may look a certain way, but as soon as I put something down next to that, it's going to change. So it's really just about visually seeing the relationships and seeing if they're working and adjusting, constantly adjusting the marks after you put them down. And then I just popped a little bit of that red rock into the tree. So I kind of made a sky hole there. I call it a sky hole, but it's, you're seeing through some of that foliage into the rock that's behind it. And so, there's a difference between just making a lot of big shapes and keeping everything separate and having a lot of little shapes and having, kind of chaos. There's a sweet spot where you can really mimic nature in the organization of shapes and colors and values. And sometimes you need to break up a shape, and sometimes you need to pull it back together and unify it more. And yeah, I think this painting is pretty much finished. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Just got some of these final touches here. Adding a little bit more into that spire. Just because I feel like, the painting can handle it. And it's great to simplify, but it's also really nice to, include how the rock actually looks, or, what's actually there if you can. And I've still just got, a few more pieces of light maybe in this rock. Some of that warmer local color in the rock. And if I were to continue to work on this piece or change anything, it might be to consolidate some of those value groups a little bit more. But overall, I think it's a good study. Kind of like a pretty well executed idea. And this was a very intuitive process. I didn't go into it with an exact plan. I just kind of had like a loose idea, and then, really used kind of intuition to bring it to life. And that can be a little bit risky, but it can also be a way of working. And I think that, when you have enough of these foundational things in mind, you can work in that way a little bit more. It's good to just keep standing back and get far away from the painting and continue to just reevaluate as you go. And it's just a lot of fun to be out here, to be in the fresh air and on the land, witnessing the beauty. Thank you so much again for being here, and I'll see you next time.